Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with a little chat, about nationalist BS when it comes to the selection of reference recordings, because it's happening, as I knew it would. We got to the Schubert Great C Major Symphony, and the three major reference recordings I cited, the two actually, were Zell in Cleveland and Munch and Boston. I actually had a third, which unfortunately wasn't referencey enough. It didn't have the exposure, which is a pity, and that was Joseph Cripps with the London Symphony Orchestra. But of course, that was conveniently ignored by the people who chimed in saying, "Oh, this is looking so American. Of course, you only know what was happening in America. You only know what people were saying in America, and your biases are naturally American." Oh, dear. Is that a bunch of hogwash? You people are so foolish. So the people who said this, of course, not like you generally. Look, we need a little history lesson, I think. We really do. It would behoove us to remember a few facts. And these are facts. After the Second World War, which is when the long-playing discography evolved and LPs were invented and stereo was invented, that was a time when, without question, the world's greatest orchestras were all in the U.S. because they had not undergone the depredations of battle. Yeah, some people were in the army and whatnot, but by and large, the orchestras had money and they had personnel and they were in really good shape. And those big five orchestras in the U.S., the big five, were Boston, Philadelphia, Cleveland, New York, and Chicago. Those were the orchestras. Now, those orchestras, with the exception of Leonard Bernstein, who came later, were unilaterally under the conductorship of really famous European conductors. We had Reiner, we had Zell, we had Ormandy, we had other people. We had Reiner, Zell, Ormandy. Philadelphia was in Boston. Munch, and Monteux. Before that, Kusevitsky. And not only were the conductors European, but an enormous percentage, amounting sometimes to even a majority, I think, of the players in the orchestras were European. So the entire concept that there is this divide between American and European is total crap. It's the delusional history in hindsight, rewriting of reality sort of mythos of latent or nascent or still with us European nationalism. This garbage that insists that there has to be this cultural divide. Sure, there are differences between the United States and Europe. Unquestionably, there are. But those differences have nothing to do with the personnel who are in charge of the major orchestras. I mean, they went to Europe in the summers. They came to America. We had guest conductors. I mean, these orchestras in the United States and in Europe, and the people who conducted and performed with them form one homogeneous group called Western culture. That's what they are. And it is all one blended thing. There is absolutely no difference. I have no interest in promoting American talent over European talent. I'm not even conscious of the fact that it may be an American orchestra. I mean, it's different when you're dealing with composers and things like that. But these orchestras are European orchestras in the European tradition, conducted by European conductors, by and large. I mean, there's just no question about that. And the people who took over who were American, I mean, in the case of Bernstein, I mean, he was trained by Fritz Reiner, Dmitri Mitropoulos, Serge Kusevitsky. It's all one thing. So I really get a little bit annoyed when people start with this nonsense, because the people who talk about those things are utterly and entirely ignorant of what the actual history was. And the truth of the matter is that the European contingent really ought to be grateful, because it was the American standard which essentially restored European orchestras to their glory, and American standards which raised them. I mean, Toscanini at NBC, Toscanini in the New York Philharmonic. The only major conductor from this period, 50s, 60s, whatever, who stayed in Europe, I mean, gloriously major conductor. I'm not talking about people like Karl Böhm or Eugen Joachim, wonderful conductors, but was Furtwängler. But we're talking about conductors who at that time were recognized to be of international stardom, right? We're not talking about musical quality necessarily, just stardom quality, right? And then after the 50s sort of ended and Europe patched itself back together, largely with American money, I might add, had to throw that one in there. But again, this is history, right? We had Herbert von Karajan, who raised the Berlin Philharmonic back to its position of preeminence. Had some orchestras that sort of stayed in good shape, like the Czech Philharmonic, but they weren't accessible to people in the West, even in Western Europe, actually, in the 60s and 70s. So the London orchestras became the great orchestras that they are today. Remember, the London Symphony Orchestra in the 50s was a wreck. I mean, Walter Legge put together the Philharmonia because there were no great orchestras in London that he found suitable to make recordings with. And so he got the Maharaja of Mysore, by the way, not anyone in Europe, to fund the Philharmonia. So Europe would have a great orchestra that he could record with. And that's how he lured Klemperer to stay in London and make recordings with the Philharmonia. Klemperer, who, during the war was, of course, in Los Angeles, along with just about all the other major artists from Europe. The ones who left came here, and America gave them a home and money and a reputation and preserved the culture that these people represented. And quite a few of them, quite ungraciously, is decamped back to Europe as soon as they possibly could to get away from the land of no culture. I mean, we know how that works, right? Because artists are basically self-regarding narcissists, and as soon as they feel they're not getting the attention they deserve or the credit that they deserve, they spitefully condemn the hand that fed them and went elsewhere and went back and fertilized Europe. Good. I'm glad that they did, because it was all the same culture. The same well. Everyone was drinking from the same well. So this business about whether I'm American or I'm choosing Americans or America this versus Europe that, I've also had people talk about these reference recordings and say, well, this was not the opinion in Europe, as if anybody who says that knew what the opinion was in Europe, all of it. The fact of the matter is, a reference recording takes some decades to sort of accumulate the necessary consensus. And by the time I was observing this consensus, which was in the 70s and 80s, these recordings from the 50s and 60s had achieved that level of consensus. And they'd achieved it everywhere. Everywhere, my friends. I mean, I there was one lovely comment about, I think it was the Schubert Ninth again, that said that, yes, this was the consensus, and I grew up in Europe. Some people knew. Some people are honest with themselves and were actually curious and maybe did a little research and looked. But the point is, my friends, it's not about right or wrong in the sense that that we're taking surveys, that we're counting numbers. I mean, the response to so much of this is just generalized hoo-ha. Critics said this. Europe said that. Europe did this. I mean, none of you people have any clue what Europe was doing. And 99.9% have no clue what critics were saying. I happen to. It was my profession. And I'm not saying that to be arrogant. I'm saying that because I had a genuine curiosity and I researched and I looked. I mean, I really did. I checked these things out. And they were the result of several decades of experience garnered in Europe, I might add, because my information did not come from 3 audio magazines in the United States. It came from running the Cannes Classical Music Awards, which involved polling several hundred critics, of which several hundred minus 20 were all in Europe. I mean, that's where the information came from. So please, 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 let's not go there. I know that there will always be some who will do that. Some people who are simply blindly nationalistic, or they take it as a point of personal pride, and anything that's not from where they are is that other, and therefore suspect. But the fact that these orchestras were the best in the 50s and 60s is a fact. Fact. Best fact. The fact that they had the best conductors from Europe is a fact. These things are not in question. They really aren't. And so, I just want those of you who are on the other side of the Atlantic, if you are young and you don't know what the history of this stuff is, or if you are old and ignorant and nationalistic and foolish, just wake up. And for heaven's sake, listen to the music. Just listen to the music. When I say something's a reference recording because it was either a great recording or because it was the best known recording. Oh, I remember what the person was talking about. It was the Van Cliburn and Tchaikovsky first. A bunch of people said, oh, you only say that because you heard about it in the United States. Well, not really. Not really. I liked Rubinstein, as I told you. Van Cliburn didn't matter to me terribly when I was growing up and listening to music. And some of you suggested Emile Gilels. Yeah, why not? Emile Gilels was great too. And he was making records in the U.S. with U.S. orchestras, with Fritz Reiner, for example. To make that kind of distinction is an insult to our intelligence. It's an insult to the intelligence of the people who are doing it, but then they don't have any, so it doesn't matter. But it's an insult to you as listeners, because the idea behind this whole series, of course, is to determine which recordings are not necessarily the best, simply the most characteristic of what the piece ought to be, so we can make comparisons with other ones. And happily, Europe has fabulous orchestras and wonderful conductors and all of those things now. Gosh, okay, you get the point, right? I got to stop before I just start talking to hear my own stupid voice. Get over it. Get over it right now. I do not accept this sort of nationalistic and foolery when it comes to the world of classical music, because there is only one world of classical music, the Western world of classical music. And anyone who plays that becomes part of the Western world of classical music. One person who knew that, and I just want to end it with that, we talked about this before, was Robert von Bahr in good old Sweden, and BIS Records, who went and made fabulous recordings in Japan, Bach recordings in Japan, Rimsky-Korsakov in Malaysia, Respighi in Brazil, because quality speaks for itself. And all those who are participating in this fabulous tradition are part of the same tradition. And I can't express that angrily or strongly enough. So keep on listening, friends, with open ears and with national and political agnosticism. Please. Thank you.